So our topic for this lesson is the digestive system. But we need to think of digestion or the digestive system as actually more than just digestion. So it's actually 4 different processes. The first is ingestion, which we're all familiar with. That's just taking in the food source. The second is digestion. That's the part where we actually need to break the food source down into smaller molecules. The third process is absorption. That's where all of the nutrients and small molecules that we need are absorbed into our body. These are basically our building blocks so that we can build and repair our cells. And the last step is elimination, which again, we're all familiar with this process of how we get rid of what we don't need and can't use. So let's think about for a minute your favorite food to eat. So one of mine would be a cheeseburger. And we're familiar with, we take a bite out of the cheeseburger, we begin to chew it. This is actually the beginning of digestion. So we have mechanical digestion, which simply means our teeth and our tongue are chewing and moving around the food just to break it up into smaller pieces. The smaller pieces produce what's basically larger surface area, so that later on, as it goes down your digestive system, there's more opportunity to make contact with those food particles. Besides just the tearing and chewing, the mechanical digestion, chemical digestion actually also starts in your mouth. And so I know that we all probably have experienced when you know you produce saliva because food smells really good to you. You go to your grandma's house, she's made your favorite dessert, or you walk into a restaurant and the smell of the food makes you produce saliva. Well, in that saliva is a special enzyme called salivary amylase. And remember that enzymes typically end in the letters ASE, so you know if you see something that ends in ASE, it's probably some kind of an enzyme. Well, this enzyme salivary amylase has an important job, and it breaks down starch. Now recall what we know about starch. Starch is a polysaccharide. Saccharide means sugar, so that means it's many, many individual sugar molecules or glucose molecules bonded together. So we would call this a complex carbohydrate. So we begin to break down starch chemically in our mouth. And after we chew and get to the point of swallowing, when we swallow, the food now is called a bolus, B-O-L-U-S. And it moves through the pharynx, which is the back of the mouth. And at the pharynx, there's essentially 2 openings. There's an opening to the respiratory system, which would be your trachea, and there's an opening to the digestive system, and this is called your esophagus. Now, we've all choked before on candy or something, and we say, oh, something went down the wrong pipe. Well, that's actually exactly what's happening. You have a special organ or structure called an epiglottis, and its job when you swallow is to close over the trachea so that food actually can't enter into your respiratory system. So when you swallow, this epiglottis closes, allowing the food to pass over the trachea and to travel down into the esophagus. So again, at this point when the food leaves the mouth and heads into the esophagus, it's called a bolus. Now the esophagus is a pretty simple organ. It's really made of smooth muscle. It's sort of like a long muscular tube. And the food doesn't just travel down the esophagus simply by gravity. There are contractions of these smooth muscles, and it's called peristalsis. And it's the contraction of the muscles that actually allow or cause the food to go down the esophagus. When you swallow your food, it takes about 7 seconds for it to travel down the esophagus to arrive at the next organ, which is called the stomach. Now I want to stop for 1 second and point out to you that there's actually an important regulator between the esophagus and the stomach, and it's called the gastroesophageal sphincter. So this exists right between the stomach and the esophagus, and the point of this sphincter is to control so that you're digesting food in your stomach doesn't come back up into the esophagus. So if you've ever experienced acid reflux, that burning sensation, that's because some of the juices from your stomach have actually come back up into your esophagus, which isn't made to handle that kind of gastric juice. So we've eaten our cheeseburger, we've chewed it, we've swallowed it, we got it down the, quote, right pipe because the epiglottis blocked the trachea. We've traveled down the esophagus, and now we've arrived at the stomach. The stomach, we'll call it a sac-like organ, and it can actually expand when you've eaten a meal to about 20 times its size when it doesn't have food in it. Digestion is going to really pick up here in the stomach, and there's several things going on that we need to point out. And first of all, the pH of the stomach is very low, somewhere between 1.5 and 2. So this is a very acidic environment. There's 3 types of cells that exist in the stomach that I want to point out to you. The first are mucus cells, and their job, as you would expect, is to make mucus. Okay, why does the stomach want to make mucus? Because the stomach lining needs protection from this really low pH juice that exists in the stomach. So these mucus cells create the mucus that actually coat or line the stomach cells. Another type of cell in the stomach is called the chief cell. So these chief cells are vital in producing another type of enzyme that's going to be important in breaking down our food, and this enzyme is actually called pepsin. The interesting thing, though, about pepsin is the chief cells don't make an active form of pepsin. They make what we call a precursor. But as soon as it's made, the low pH environment in the stomach actually activates the pepsin so that it begins its job. What does pepsin do? Well, its main purpose is to begin the chemical digestion of protein. So remember, we started chemical digestion of starches in the mouth, and that continues in the stomach, but now we've added another enzyme called pepsin, which begins our protein digestion. The third type of cell in the stomach is called the parietal cell, and the job of that cell is to produce an acid called hydrochloric acid, or HCl. The hydrochloric acid is what causes the stomach pH to be as low as it is, which helps with digesting food, but it also does a great job of killing any microorganisms that are on the food or in the food that we've eaten to prevent us from getting sick from our food. The stomach is also made up of smooth muscle like the esophagus, and peristalsis continues these contraction of the smooth muscles so that the contents in the stomach, so all of these juices that are made by the stomach cells and the bolus that you swallowed, are mixed together every 20 minutes. Once your bolus has mixed with the stomach juices, sometimes it's called gastric juice, now it is actually called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. Now, we've ingested our food, we're still in the process of digestion, but we have not begun absorption yet. There's actually very little absorption of nutrients that happens while the chyme is in the stomach. A few things can be absorbed, like water and some ions, and a few drugs will actually be absorbed in the stomach. Alcohol is certainly absorbed in the stomach, which is why you feel the effects of alcohol sooner. And the peristalsis continues to mix all of this chyme together. Now, I mentioned that it takes about 7 seconds when you swallow for the bolus to go down the esophagus into the stomach, depending on what kind of food, because some foods take longer to break down than others. Digestion in the stomach takes somewhere between 2 to 6 hours. But the stomach doesn't empty the whole contents all at once into the small intestine. Instead, it empties in small portions into the next organ, which we're going to talk about, which is called the small intestine. So we mentioned our first sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach, the gastroesophageal sphincter. We have another sphincter now between the stomach and the small intestine called the pyloric sphincter. And so, as you might guess, its job is to regulate when the stomach empties into the small intestine. This just controls so that there's not an overload on the small intestine all at once. It's small amounts that are released into the small intestine. One last thing I want to say about the stomach, besides just having the mucus there for protection, another important part about how the stomach keeps its own cells healthy is that it doesn't produce these gastric juices like the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin all the time. It begins producing these juices when it receives the bolus that you swallow, similar to how the salivary glands make saliva in response to your eating food. So as the chyme is in small amounts released from the stomach into the small intestine through the pyloric sphincter, it actually, we have a certain region of the small intestine that's the beginning of the small intestine from the stomach that's called the duodenum or duodenum. And what I want you to know generally about the small intestine is that digestion, first of all, is completed here. So by the time the chyme leaves the small intestine, all digestion has been completed. The other important function I want you to know about the small intestine is that the majority of all nutrient absorption, in other words, the good stuff out of your food, whether it's sugars or amino acids or vitamins, most of these are absorbed while they are making their way through the small intestine. The small intestine is named because of its smaller diameter. It is actually much longer than the large intestine, about 3 to 7 meters in length. The other important thing to know about the small intestine is that there are several what I'll call accessory organs that are vital, that contribute important components that are delivered directly to the small intestine. So in a minute, we'll talk about the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas and their important role in digestion. Now, food never actually enters into the liver or the gallbladder or the pancreas, but without the components that they produce, the small intestine could not do its job. If you looked at the inside of the small intestine, what you would find is something called villi, V-I-L-L-I. And these villi are essentially, they're called finger-like projections because if you look at your hand, the way that the fingers extend up and down, and what that does is it creates a greater amount of surface area. In other words, the amount of the tissue in the small intestine that the digested juices are beginning to make contact with. On top of each villi, there are actually more smaller villi called microvilli. And again, you have an even greater surface area. So with the villi and the microvilli, you increase the surface area of the small intestine about 600 times. Now, why is that important in the small intestine? Well, as I mentioned, what is happening here? Well, all of the nutrients that have been digested are being absorbed. Well, what does that mean to be absorbed? Well, that means that there has to be part of your blood supply, your capillaries, that are next to the tissue of your small intestine. And therefore, the nutrients are simply going to diffuse from the small intestine through to your capillaries so that then they can be transferred throughout your body and cells where you can utilize those nutrients. Now let's talk for just a second about the pancreas and what role it plays. So most of the digestive enzymes, so remember, small intestine is responsible for absorption of nutrients, but it's also the place where digestion gets completed. So most of the digestive enzymes in the small intestine are going to be sent to the small intestine from the pancreas. So there is a duct, which is essentially like a tube, that carries these digestive enzymes directly from the pancreas to the small intestine. And in this pancreatic juice, we can call it, there are several enzymes that play an important role in digestion. A couple of them are trypsin and chymotrypsin, and their job is to continue protein digestion. Remember that we actually begun protein digestion in the stomach because the stomach cells made pepsin, which started the digestion of proteins. The proteins are going to complete their digestion in the small intestine with the assistance of these two enzymes, trypsin and chymotrypsin, which are provided by the pancreas. Another enzyme provided by the pancreas is amylase, which should be familiar to you because remember, we also produce amylase in our salivary glands in the mouth. So we started digestion of starch in the mouth, but we're going to complete that digestion in the small intestine. We also have enzymes delivered from the pancreas called lipases. These are enzymes that are responsible for breaking down fats. Now, I want to just make a little note to you there. Hold on to that. We're going to talk more about fat digestion in just a second. Another important enzyme sent by the pancreas is called a nuclease. And nucleases break down nucleic acids in our food. So if you've ever paid attention to your nutrition, or if you've counted calories for a diet, you know that essentially you're looking in your diet for how many grams of protein, how many grams of carbohydrates, and how many grams of fat. But nobody ever counts how many grams of nucleic acid that they're eating in their food. And that's because nucleic acids are in the food you eat, because that's DNA. Plants have DNA, animals have DNA. So when you eat meat or you eat salad, there's DNA in that food. You're digesting that into its individual little nucleotides, which is what makes up DNA, but we don't use that as an energy source. Protein we use as an energy source, carbohydrate we use as an energy source, and fat we use as an energy source, but not nucleotides, which is why we don't think about that as part of digestion. But your cells need to be able to repair, divide, and when they do that, we need nucleotides. So we get those partly from our diet. The other important thing to know that the pancreas contributes to the small intestine is in this pancreatic juice that gets sent through the pancreatic duct to the small intestine, there is going to be a basic or an alkaline solution. Remember that the stomach pH was about 1.5 to 2 because the stomach cells created the hydrochloric acid, which created this very low acidic pH environment. Well, the small intestine really needs a neutralization of that really low pH as the gastric juice comes from the stomach. Well, this is supplied by the pancreas. So basic or alkaline is the opposite of acid. It's a higher pH, and so this begins to neutralize some of that very low pH gastric juice as it enters into the small intestine. We have to talk a little more about the digestion of fats, and we need to do that by starting with the liver. So the liver has many roles in the body, including when you drink alcohol, it detoxifies the alcohol, it stores glycogen, it releases glucose into your blood when you need it, it stores iron and fat-soluble vitamins, and it produces blood-clotting proteins. Those are just a few, and as we move through the different body systems, we'll talk more about the liver. But I want us to focus in on what role does the liver play specifically with the digestive system, and that role is it produces something called bile, B-I-L-E, and this bile then actually gets delivered from the liver through another duct to the gallbladder, and the gallbladder really serves as a storage compartment for bile. Then the gallbladder has a duct that carries this bile directly to the small intestine. Now, why is bile important for digestion? Well, lipases that we mentioned that come from the pancreas are going to break down fats. However, fats are hydrophobic. They don't do well in water, right? They clump up together. But lipases can only make contact then with the very outside of these fat droplets. So again, we need more surface area for our fat droplets. Well, that's what bile does. Bile begins to break those fat droplets up into smaller and smaller fat droplets so that the lipases have more area to make contact with the fats to break them down into smaller and smaller pieces. Now, some of you may know someone who had gallbladder surgery and had their gallbladder removed. And so sometimes what happens is there's cholesterol in bile and it may crystallize in that duct, which causes a lot of pain and it can cause an infection. So we can live without a gallbladder. It's just in the case that there's not a gallbladder present, the bile comes directly from the liver right into the small intestine. As we travel then from the small intestine to the large intestine, remember, all digestion is over. All of our food sources has been broken down into its individual nutrients. The vast majority of those nutrients have been absorbed, and the purpose of the villi and the microvilli is to allow this very large surface area so that more nutrients can be absorbed. If there are problems in the small intestine and we have unhealthy villi or microvilli, then we're not absorbing the nutrients to the degree that we should be absorbing them. Moving on, the next organ that we enter is the large intestine. The main job of the large intestine, well, the few main jobs, is to reclaim or absorb water, and along with that come reabsorption or absorption of salts and minerals. And the other job of this large intestine is to eliminate waste that we cannot utilize. Two important vitamins, though, are also produced in the large intestine, the B vitamins and vitamin K. and we'll talk about that in just a second, so put that on hold. So as I mentioned earlier, the large intestine is called the large intestine because it has a larger diameter. It's actually shorter in length than the small intestine. Besides absorbing water and salts and minerals, it does produce waste, which we call feces, and you may be interested to know what actually makes up feces. So it's first of all undigested fiber. So we want fiber in our diet, but that's not because we utilize the nutrients in fiber. That's because it helps keep us regular. It's easier on our digestive system. Things move through easier. And so undigested fiber is going to make up part of your waste. Bacteria are going to make up part of your waste. And then the other part of your waste is your intestinal cells that actually get sloughed off during the digestive process. So this waste product, the feces, actually collects in the rectum and it's eliminated by the anus. Now we've talked about several sphincter muscles throughout the digestive tract, and I want to point out to you that most of those sphincters are under involuntary control, meaning you don't think about whether or not, oh, do I want to let food from my stomach to my small intestine? That's not something that I think about voluntarily. However, there are two sphincter muscles that are under voluntary control, and this is why we can leave our house and go places, because the sphincter muscle at the end of your GI tract before you release your waste is under voluntary control, so that you control when you release your feces. The other one is in your mouth when you swallow. That's under voluntary control. Okay, I mentioned to you that B vitamins and vitamin K are important vitamins that are produced in the large intestine. And we owe that to the intestinal microbes that colonize your large intestine or your colon. Now, a downside to these microbes is that they produce smelly gas, and that's why we have smelly gas, because of these microbes. However, they have several benefits. First of all, because they've colonized your colon, it prevents bad pathogenic bacteria from being able to colonize your colon. And if you've ever had an intestinal infection, then you know you'd much rather have your normal microbes and your smelly gas than the other things that come along with pathogenic bacteria. But these bacteria are actually what are responsible for producing the B vitamins and the vitamin K that you absorb in your large intestine. One other topic I want to talk about, which may or may not affect you or someone you know, is lactose intolerance. So what does it mean to be lactose intolerant? You know that means somehow you can't drink milk or eat ice cream or things like that without having discomfort. Well, lactose is actually a sugar found in milk. It's a disaccharide, Latin for two, essentially meaning two sugars together. And so you need an enzyme in your digestive system that breaks down disaccharides. And so the specific enzyme that does that is called lactase. Remember, enzymes end in ASE. Well, some people stop making this enzyme lactase at some point in their lives, and if you don't make that enzyme, then your digestive system does not break down that particular disaccharide, and so it stays as a two-sugar component. And then as it travels down into your large intestine, the bacteria that we mentioned there that are responsible for giving us vitamin K and the B vitamins actually ferment that sugar, and it causes pain and bloating and gas. So one suggestion is, if you eat dairy products like yogurt and some cheeses that have already been fermented, then the lactose sugar has already been broken down by the bacteria. But if you eat fresh dairy products like milk and some ice creams and some cheeses, then they may cause you more issues.